The first stone refused to yield. It was a slab of granite, 3 feet wide and nearly as long, its edges buried in the damp earth of the quarry face. Ilara had been working at it since dawn, her breath pluming in the crisp morning air. She drove the iron wedge into a fissure she had spent the better part of a week chiseling, the rhythmic clang of her hammer against the steel a lonely drumbeat in the silent woods. Beside her, a large, gray-coated dog with intelligent, patient eyes watched her every move. Fen did not bark or whine. He simply sat, a steadfast shadow, his tail giving a slow, supportive thump against the fallen leaves whenever she paused to wipe sweat from her brow. She was 18, but the set of her jaw and the quiet competence of her hands belonged to someone much older. 7 years of solitude on the edge of Oakhaven had weathered her, carving away all that was soft or superfluous. Finally, with a deep groan that seemed to rise from the bones of the mountain, the stone shifted. It scraped against its neighbors, and then, with a final percussive crack, it broke free, sliding a few inches down the muddy slope before coming to rest. A victory. It was the cornerstone. Ilara leaned against the quarry wall, her muscles trembling with exhaustion. Her hands, wrapped in worn leather strips, were already raw. This was the first of more than 200 stones she would need. She looked at the granite slab, then back toward the distant curl of smoke that marked the village. They had called her a liar, a frightened, fanciful child. Magistrate Thorne, his face a mask of stern disappointment, had declared her tales of glowing chimney bricks and the smell of burning pine from within the walls of their own homes a malicious fantasy. She was 11. Her father, a stonemason with ink-stained fingers and a mind full of unsettling theories, had just been buried, the victim of a house fire no one could explain. When she tried to show them his journals, filled with drawings of failing flues and calculations of heat stress on mortar, they had cast her out, not with violence but with the cold, quiet shunning that was Oakhaven's way. Her small inheritance, a plot of land a mile from the village edge, a few coins, and her father's tools, was deemed a merciful sentence. Fen nudged his wet nose into her palm, a silent question. She stroked his head, her gaze fixed on the stone. "It'll work," she whispered, the words tasting strange in her mouth. She so rarely spoke. Fen's tail thumped again. He believed her. That was enough. The rest of the day was spent clearing a path and rigging the stone to a crude sled her father had built. It was a brutal, thankless task. She used levers and rollers, her own weight and Fen's steady pulling, to inch the massive slab, weighing nearly 1,000 pounds, onto the wooden runners. The sun was setting, casting long, skeletal shadows through the trees by the time she had it secured. She did not look at her bleeding hands. There was no one to show them to, no one to offer sympathy. There was only the work. The next morning, the sound of an axe echoed from nearby. Silas, the village's master carpenter, was marking trees for felling. He was a man made of wood and leather, his face a roadmap of winters endured. He saw her dragging the sled, Fen straining in his harness beside her, and stopped his work. He walked over, his expression a mixture of pity and disbelief. "What in the Creator's name is this, girl?" he asked, his voice rough as bark. He gestured with his axe toward the enormous stone. Ilara paused, her shoulders aching. "A foundation." Silas let out a short, humorless laugh. "A foundation for what? Are you building a fortress against squirrels?" He looked at her small, sturdy cabin, then at the cleared patch of ground 50 yards away, where she had driven stakes into the earth. The staked area was immense, a 20-foot square. "That's the craziest thing I've ever seen. You can't build something that size alone. not with stone. "I have a plan," she said, her voice flat and quiet. "A plan?" Silas shook his head, leaning on his axe. "Let me tell you what's going to happen. You'll break your back hauling a dozen of these. The first freeze will come, and you'll give it up. That pile of rocks will sit there and gather moss until you're old and gray. What are you even trying to build?" Ilara looked at the stakes, at the empty space that was so full in her mind. She could see it already. The soaring walls, the great arched opening, the column of clean white smoke rising against a winter sky. "A hearth," she said. Silas stared at her as if she'd just confessed to witchcraft. "A hearth? Out here? It's bigger than the meeting hall. Girl, you've been alone too long. Your father, he had strange ideas, but this is madness." He softened his tone slightly. "Listen to an old man who knows a thing or two. Board up for winter, stock your wood. Don't waste your strength on this folly." "This is my home," Ilara stated simply, picking up the rope. It was not an argument. It was a fact. She leaned into the harness, and Fen dug his paws into the dirt, and together they moved the great stone another foot. Silas watched them for a long moment, then shook his head again and returned to his trees. The sound of his axe resumed, faster this time, angrier. He was a good man, but he was a man of Oakhaven. He believed in what was known. Ilara believed in what her father had proven, in the lines and numbers of his faded journal. That journal was her only scripture. It spoke of thermal shock, of creosote buildup in narrow flues, of lime mortar crumbling under sustained high heat. It predicted a day when a winter, colder than any before, would turn their cozy single-flue chimneys into columns of fire. It predicted ruin. And at the very back, on the last 10 pages, it detailed the solution. A massive, freestanding, multi-walled hearth with a flue wide enough for a man to climb, built to draw smoke and radiate heat with unparalleled efficiency. A structure to warm a whole community. A structure they had called a lie. Weeks passed. The forest floor turned from green to gold. Ilara worked from before sunrise until after sunset. The hauling was the worst of it. She made the trip to the quarry and back 87 times. Each journey was a slow, agonizing pilgrimage of sweat and straining muscle. She learned the language of leverage, the subtle physics of friction and momentum. Her body transformed. The soft lines of her youth hardened into the dense, functional muscle of a laborer. Her hands became permanently calloused, the skin thick as boot leather. Fen's paws grew raw, and she would spend the evenings by the fire, gently rubbing salve into them while she studied her father's drawings by candlelight. She spoke to the dog in quiet tones, not for conversation, but to hear the shape of her father's words in the air. "The inner wall must be soapstone," she'd murmur, tracing a diagram. "It holds the heat. The outer wall, granite for strength. A 3-inch gap between them, filled with sand, to insulate and allow for expansion." Fen would rest his heavy head on her lap, his deep brown eyes reflecting the firelight, a silent, unwavering vote of confidence. One afternoon, as she was wrestling a particularly awkward piece of soapstone onto her sled, a horse and rider appeared on the path. It was Magistrate Thorn. He had aged, the lines of certainty on his face now carved deeper. "The woodcutters. They say you are engaged, the woodcutters. They say you are engaged in a significant construction." Ilara straightened up, her back screaming in protest. She did not wipe the dirt from her cheek. "I am building," she agreed. Thorn's gaze swept over the growing mountain of stone near her cabin. There were over 100 pieces now, sorted by size and type. It was an astonishing amount of work for one person. For a moment, a flicker of something, was it grudging respect, crossed his face, but it was gone as quickly as it came. "To what end?" he asked. "The village council is concerned. Such a monumental effort. It seems obsessive, unhealthy for a young woman living alone." "I am healthy," she replied. Her eyes met his, and for the first time since she was a child, she did not look away. "People are talking," Thorn continued, ignoring her statement. "They say you are building a monument to your father's madness, that you are wasting your life on a dream that will collapse in the first heavy snow. What will you do then? Who will you turn to when this fantasy fails you?" "It will not fail," she said. The certainty in her voice was absolute, unnerving. It was the same tone her father had used. Thorn's jaw tightened. He had heard that tone before, in a crowded town meeting, right before he had branded a brilliant man a public menace. "See that it doesn't," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, heavy with threat. He spurred his horse and rode away without another word, leaving Ilara standing in a cloud of dust and disapproval. She watched him go, then turned back to the stone. His words were just noise. The stone was real. The work was real. The coming cold was real. As autumn deepened and the air grew sharp with the promise of frost, she began the foundation. She dug until she hit bedrock, a solid shelf of stone 4 feet below the surface. She spent 2 weeks leveling it, using a water-filled wooden trough as a spirit level, her father's design. It had to be perfect. The entire structure, weighing well over 60 tons, would rest on this single point of contact with the earth. One evening, a young man named Liam, a trapper who lived on the far side of the mountain and rarely came to Oakhaven, stopped by her camp. He was lean and quiet, with kind eyes that held no judgment. He had seen her work from a distance for months. He carried 2 rabbits, cleaned and dressed. "For your pot," he said, holding them out. "I see you work hard, harder than any man I know." Ilara was wary. Kindness was a currency she had long forgotten. "What do you want?" Liam shrugged, placing the rabbits on a clean stump. "Nothing. Just figured you could use the meat. My name's Liam." He looked at the perfectly level bedrock in the massive pit. "That's a true foundation. My grandfather was a mason. He would have admired that." He didn't ask what she was building. He didn't call her crazy. He just saw the quality of the work. "Ilara," she said, her own name feeling foreign. He nodded. "Ilara." He pointed at the growing piles of clay and sand she'd been hauling from the creek bed. "You'll need lime for your mortar. Good lime. There's a limestone deposit up on the north ridge. It's a hard climb, but it makes the strongest mortar." He gave her a small, shy smile. "I could show you, if you want." She considered it for a long moment. The journal specified the need for high-quality lime, but she hadn't known where to find it. Her father's knowledge had been theoretical. Liam's was practical. "I would," she said. It was more than she had said to anyone, other than Fen, in years. Liam became a quiet fixture in her life. He never touched her tools or offered to lay a single stone, respecting the solitary nature of her vow. But he would appear with food, or a new whetstone for her chisels, or a bundle of dry firewood. He helped her haul the limestone, sack by heavy sack, down the treacherous north ridge. He sat with her while she painstakingly mixed her mortar in a great wooden trough, following her father's precise ratios of lime, sand, clay, and horsehair. He watched, fascinated, as she began to lay the first course of stones. She worked with a slow, deliberate grace. Each stone was chosen, turned, and studied before being set. She used no string lines, only her eye and a small plumb bob. She was not merely stacking rocks, she was weaving them together, fitting their unique shapes into a seamless, interlocking whole. The outer wall of granite rose first, thick and formidable. Then came the inner wall of soapstone, its smooth gray surface cool to the touch. She filled the 3-inch gap between them with sand, tamping it down with a long pole. The work was hypnotic, a meditation in stone. The sun beat down, the autumn rains came, and she worked under a hide tarp, the water dripping from its edges in a steady curtain. Mara, a woman from the village who had once been her mother's friend, came one day, her face etched with worry. She brought a loaf of bread and a small pot of jam. "Elara, child, winter is coming. The first snows have already touched the high peaks. What is this for?" "For the winter," Elara said, fitting a heavy lintel stone above what would be the hearth's opening. It was a single piece of granite, 10 feet long and weighing half a ton. She had spent a week inching it up a ramp of earth and logs. "But your cabin is warm," Mara insisted, gesturing to the small, efficient wood stove Elara used. This is a thing for a generation, not for one girl. Please, come back to the village. The council would let you. Thorn is hard, but the people have softened. They would find you a room." "I have a room," Elara said, her gaze unwavering. "This is my work." Mara looked at Elara's face, thin and smudged with dirt but illuminated by a fierce inner light. She saw the quiet certainty there and knew her words were useless. She left the bread and jam on the stump where Liam left his offerings. "Be safe, child," she whispered, and hurried away, as if the scale of the project itself were a kind of contagion. The first snow fell not on the peaks, but in the valley. It was early, a light dusting that melted by noon, but it was a warning. The race was on. Elara began working on the great flue. It was a chimney within a chimney, a square column of fired brick she had made herself, rising through the center of the structure. The design was the core of her father's genius. It was tapered, with a complex system of baffles that would force the hot air to linger, heating the soapstone core, while the smoke itself was drawn powerfully upward by the sheer height and width of the passage. It was designed never to clog, never to choke, never to allow creosote to build up to dangerous levels. She worked on a scaffold of her own design, hoisting stones and mortar up with a simple rope and pulley. Liam, seeing her struggle, rigged a better system for her with a counterweight, allowing her to lift twice the weight with half the effort. He never asked why it had to be so big, so complex. He just saw the problem in front of him. A girl trying to lift a 100-pound stone 20 feet in the air, and solved it. His trust was a quiet warmth, more real than any fire. By the time the ground was frozen solid and the snows came to stay, the structure was complete. It stood 30 feet tall, a monolithic tower of gray granite, silent and imposing against the white landscape. It looked ancient, primal. From the outside, it was just a stone tower with a single, massive, arched opening at its base. But inside, it was a cathedral of warmth. The hearth opening was 10 feet wide and 7 feet high. The firebox itself was deep enough to hold logs 6 feet long. The interior walls of soapstone glowed with a soft, pearlescent sheen. Silas came by one last time before the deep winter locked them all in their homes. He walked around the structure, touching the cold stone, his breath misting in the air. He peered into the dark maw of the hearth. "You did it," he said, his voice holding a note of awe he couldn't conceal. "You actually did it." Then the skepticism returned. But will it draw? A flue that big, it might just fill your house with smoke, or the cold air will pour down it and freeze you solid. Wait until a real storm hits. That will be the test. It will draw, Ilara said. She laid her hand on the stone. It was cold, but she could feel the immense sleeping potential within it. It was more than a building. It was a promise. She had hauled 217 stones. She had mixed 3 tons of mortar. She had given a year of her life to this pile of rocks. It was her vindication, waiting for its moment. That night, she and Finn slept in her small cabin, as always. But she left the door to the great hearth open, an invitation to the winter. The winter arrived not as a guest, but as an invader. It came from the north, a wall of white that swallowed the mountains and descended upon Oakhaven with a low, guttural roar. They called it the Great Freeze. The temperature plummeted to depths no one had ever recorded. It was a dry, merciless cold that found every crack in every wall, that turned buckets of water to solid ice in minutes, that made the very air painful to breathe. The snow fell without end, piling in monstrous drifts that buried fences and blocked doors. Oakhaven, a village that prided itself on its resilience, was brought to its knees. Inside their sturdy wooden homes, the people stoked their fires, feeding them constantly. But the chimneys, the very same designs her father had railed against, began to fail. The intense, unrelenting cold from the outside created a column of frigid air within the narrow flues. Smoke, heavy with moisture and soot, cooled too quickly, condensing into a thick, tarry creosote that froze to the brickwork. The passages narrowed. Fires, starved for air, smoldered and smoked, filling houses with a choking haze. People tried to clear them with brushes from the roof, but the ice was too thick. They were trapped. The first disaster struck at the baker's. Desperate to keep his family warm and his ovens hot, he'd built a roaring fire. The choked flue, unable to vent the heat, superheated the surrounding mortar until it crumbled. A single ember found its way into the wall space, landing on a tinder-dry pine beam. Within an hour, the back half of his house was an inferno. The volunteer fire brigade, fighting through waist-deep snow and a wind that stole their breath, could do little more than watch it burn, their buckets of water freezing before they could be thrown. The baker and his family escaped with only their lives and the clothes on their backs. 2 days later, it was the weaver's cottage. Then a small fire broke out in the magistrate's own manor. Panic, colder and sharper than the wind, swept through the village. To light a fire was to risk burning your house down. To not light a fire was to freeze to death. The heart of the village, the central hearth in the meeting hall, had also failed, its chimney blocked solid with ice and tar. They were a people of the forest, a people of the fire, and now their fires were betraying them. Ilara knew. She could smell it on the wind, the acrid tang of burning pitch pine mixed with the clean, cold scent of snow. She had been keeping a small, steady fire burning in the great hearth for days. The draw was immense, a constant, hungry pull of air that fed the flames and sent a thick, clean column of white smoke straight up into the gray sky. The outer granite walls were still cold to the touch, but inside the structure, the air was filled with a deep, radiant warmth. The soapstone core had absorbed the heat, and now it gave it back, a gentle, pervasive heat that felt like sunlight. Fen lay stretched out on the stone floor, a dozen feet from the flames, his fur warm, his sleep untroubled. The knock on her cabin door was frantic, barely audible over the howl of the wind. Ilara opened it to find a figure caked in snow, their face nearly hidden by a thick scarf. It was Mara. She was holding her youngest child, a boy of 4, wrapped in every blanket she owned. The boy was shivering violently, his lips blue. Elara, Mara sobbed, her words tumbling out in ragged bursts. Please, our fire went out. The house, it's colder than the grave. We can't get another one lit. The smoke just pours into the room. Can we, just for an hour? Her eyes fell on the great hearth behind Elara, on the impossible sight of a huge, open fire burning cleanly, its light a warm, golden promise in the frozen twilight. Elara said nothing. She simply stepped aside and held the door open wider. Mara stumbled in, her eyes wide with disbelief as the wave of warmth washed over her. She unwrapped her son and carried him toward the hearth, not too close to the fire, but into the sphere of its radiant heat. The boy's shivering began to subside. He stared into the flames, mesmerized. "It's so warm," Mara whispered, tears freezing on her cheeks. "How is this possible? There's no smoke." "The flue is wide," Elara said, ladling hot broth from a pot suspended over the fire. "It draws." She handed the cup to Mara. It was the simplest explanation. It was the complete explanation. Within the hour, another family arrived. It was the baker, his wife, and their 3 children, their faces smudged with soot and despair. Liam had found them huddled in a snow-covered woodshed and led them to her. They said nothing, simply stared at the impossible fire, their shame and desperation a palpable weight in the air. Elara gestured for them to come in. She and Liam began bringing in the stores of firewood she had spent the autumn cutting and stacking, a supply so vast Silas had laughed at it. It was not a season's worth of wood for one person, it was a season's worth for a village. By nightfall, the trickle had become a flood. They came in 2s and 3s, families pulling sleds piled with blankets and what little food they had managed to save. They were beaten, humbled, and terrified. Silas the carpenter was among them, his usual gruffness replaced by a quiet, stunned silence. He walked over to Elara, who was tending a burn on a young girl's arm with a salve of comfrey and yarrow. He looked from the roaring fire to the crowd of 30 people now sheltered within the stone walls. He looked at the high, arching roof, black with soot but holding strong. "It's drawing," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He wasn't talking about the chimney, he was talking about the people. "You built it for this." Elara finished wrapping the girl's arm. "I built it to work," she corrected him gently. The last to arrive was Magistrate Thorne. He did not come with a sled or a family. He came alone, his face gray with exhaustion and defeat. The fire at his manor had been contained, but the great house was a frozen, smoke-filled shell. He stood in the great arched opening, the howling wind at his back, and surveyed the scene. His entire village, the people he was meant to protect, was huddled inside a structure built by the girl he had exiled for being a liar. He was a tall man, but in that moment he seemed to shrink. He looked at the faces of his people, safe and warm. He looked at the fire, burning with a clean, impossible power. Finally, he looked at her. "The chimneys," he said, his voice raspy. "They're failing, just like he said they would." It was a confession, an admission that spanned years of willful ignorance. He took a ragged breath. "You told us. You tried to warn us." He did not say he was sorry. The words would have been too small. Instead, he looked at the stone walls, at the soaring craftsmanship, at the salvation she had built with her bare hands. "You were right," he said. The words hung in the warm air, simple, heavy, and complete. It was the only apology that mattered. Elara simply nodded, then turned to add another log to the fire. Warmth into a frozen world. They were alive, breathing warmth into a frozen world. They were stone and fire and life. The Great Freeze lasted for 17 days. For 17 days, the hearth burned without pause, a colossal, unwavering heart of light and warmth. Ilara's structure became the village of Oakhaven. Liam, with his quiet competence, organized the rationing of food and the sleeping shifts. Silas, his skepticism transformed into fervent belief, organized teams to cut more firewood from the deadfall in the nearby woods, following paths Ilara had cleared months before. Mara led the women in caring for the children and the sick. And Ilara, the outcast, became the keeper of the flame. She moved with a quiet authority, tending the fire, checking the stone for stress, treating frostbite and burns, her presence a calming anchor in the storm. The hearth she had built was saving there. The hearth she had built was saving their bodies, but the quiet, stubborn girl who built it was saving their spirit. When the freeze finally broke and the sun returned, weak but welcome, the people emerged from the great hearth not as scattered, frightened individuals, but as a community forged anew in the fire. Years passed. Oakhaven was rebuilt, but it was not the same village. The great hearth, which the people now called Ilara's Heart, became the true center of their town. The old meeting hall was torn down, and a new one was built adjoining the hearth, incorporating its radiant warmth. New homes were constructed, not with the flawed, narrow chimneys of the past, but with the wide, safe, double-walled flues from her father's journal. Ilara, no longer the exile, became the master mason of Oakhaven. She did not rule or command, she taught. Young men and women who had once been taught to fear her now came to learn the language of stone, the mathematics of heat, the patience of true construction. Liam, who had stood by her when no one else would, stood by her still, his quiet friendship deepening into a partnership as solid and dependable as the foundations she laid. They built a life together, not in her old cabin, but in a small, sturdy house they constructed near the heart, its walls made from the leftover granite of her first great labor. The seasons turned, each one etching new lines of character onto the face of the land and its people. The skepticism that had once defined Oakhaven was replaced by a deep-seated respect for quiet wisdom and patient work. They became a village of builders, of thinkers, their survival forever linked to the memory of a great failure and a greater salvation. One crisp autumn evening, decades after the Great Freeze, Fen lay on the warm stone floor before the hearth. He was old, his muzzle white, his magnificent gray coat thinned with age. His movements had been slow for years, his loyal shadow sticking ever closer to Ilara's side. He had been her first believer, her constant witness. His intelligent eyes, now clouded with age, were fixed on the dancing flames. Ilara sat beside him, her hand resting on his flank, feeling the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of his breathing. Her own hair was streaked with silver, her hands gnarled and powerful, a testament to a life of labor and purpose. Fen gave a soft sigh, a sound of deep contentment, and rested his heavy head on his paws. He did not lift it again. Ilara sat with him through the night, the great fire casting their joined shadow against the soapstone wall, a silent vigil for a life of unwavering loyalty. She buried him the next morning on the small hill overlooking the hearth, beneath a young oak tree. There was no stone, only the living wood to mark the children she had taught become master children she had taught become master builders themselves, their own hands bearing the proud calluses of their trade. They called her Grandmother Ilara, the foundation of their town. Her father's name, once synonymous with madness, was now spoken with reverence. His journals were copied and studied, the basis of their new prosperity and safety. The lie she was exiled for had become their most sacred truth. When her time came, It was as peaceful as fens. She passed away in her sleep, the faint, comforting scent of wood smoke in the air. The entire village mourned her. They did not bury her in the common cemetery, but on the hill beside Finn, where she could forever watch over the heart she had built. Silas's grandson, a stonemason with Alara's patient hands, carved her grave marker. It was not a grand monument, but a simple, solid slab of granite, taken from the same quarry where she had begun her work so long ago. The epitaph was short, its words chosen by Liam, his own hair now as white as snow. It did not speak of kings or battles, but of the quiet, enduring power of a single, stubborn soul. It read, "Ilara, she built a hearth. It warmed us all." Long after they were all gone, long after the names of Thorn and Silas and Liam were lost to memory, the structure remained. Through winters harsh and mild, through the changing of seasons and the passing of centuries, Ilara's heart stood as a silent, monolithic testament against the northern sky. Smoke still rose from its great chimney, a steady pulse of life at the center of the village. A permanent monument not to a queen or a warrior, but to a quiet girl who, when the world called her a liar, answered with stone.